Здравствуйте, товарищи. Welcome back to Russian Through Propaganda. We're on day 70, and today we're going to talk a little bit more about comparatives, look at some details we didn't cover yesterday, and also add superlatives, which thankfully are extremely easy in Russian. So let's start out with the issue of compound comparatives. Now you may know that, or maybe you wondered yesterday, right, that English, of course, has normal comparatives like faster, better, etc. A lot of them end in er. And then it can also form compound comparatives, which we do with a lot of, especially longer adjectives like intelligent. We don't say intelligenter, right? We say more intelligent. So Russian actually has something similar. So let's take a look at what those Russian compound comparatives look like, and then talk about when we can use them, when we have to use them, and so forth. So let's just take an adjective like svetly, and which means bright. Then, as we learned yesterday, we could get a comparative form, just a basic comparative form in yeah. Since svetly is two syllables, the stress jumps to the ending as we would expect, and we get svetleye. Okay, so the compound form is built off a word that looks a lot like больше, which we learned yesterday, right? Which means more, or larger, or more. And so it's basically almost, a synonymous, just another version of that same idea, более. So we can see that that itself is a comparative form, and basically we can use that. We can combine that with ordinary adjectives to get a compound comparative for that adjective. For example, более светлый means more bright, brighter, or more bright. And by the way, if you're wondering, how do you say less X, right? Less bright. Well, there we use another comparative form, менее, which again looks a little bit like меньше that we learned yesterday, meaning less or smaller, right? So менее светлый means less bright. Okay, so when can we use these things? Well, we can see obviously that they're quite a bit easier than forming the ordinary comparatives, especially those irregular ones we learned yesterday, right? The comparative forms generally are a little bit tricky. So you might be tempted to use these compound forms all the time in Russian. And while that will be intelligible and grammatically not really incorrect, it's not what Russians would normally use, right? So think of the forms we learned yesterday, like светлее, or again all these irregular forms like громче, жарче, лучше, хуже, etc., etc. Think of those as your default, right? So when in doubt, use the forms we learned yesterday. But there are situations in Russian where we basically have to resort to the compound comparative forms with более or менее, right? Now, the first thing, actually, we can jump to the last example here. Of course, if we want to say less at all, we have to use менее, right? There are no other comparative forms meaning less, right? So that's kind of a no-brainer, right? So, for example, I want to live in a less dark apartment. Я хочу жить в менее темной квартире. Right, so no doubt on that one. But if we look a bit more at what's going on here, remember that in these compound forms, we're combining the более or менее with just the ordinary adjective, which means that that adjective can go into any case. Right, in this case, we're saying in a less dark apartment, right? В менее темной квартире. Темной is modifying квартире. It's in the prepositional singular. And of course, менее here is acting as an adverb modifying темный, right? How much dark or whatever. Well, actually less dark, right? Менее темной, в менее темной квартире. Okay, so that gives us a clue as to when we would use the compound comparatives with более, right? Basically, we use these when we need to show case, right? When we need to show a case ending on an adjective. Now, if we think back to yesterday, we learned that the basic compound forms we learned are they do double duty, right? They themselves are actually adverbial. They can serve as adverbs, as comparative adverbs, and as comparative adjectives, right? So we learned, for example, that быстрее from быстрый, быстрее can mean more quickly or faster, right? It can be an adverb or an adjective. Okay, so basically these compound comparatives are adjectives, strictly speaking. They have adjectival endings. We can change those endings to show case. We can show clearly that they modify a given noun and so forth. Right, so let's look at this, the examples. Тебя интересует более светлая квартира, не так ли? Right, so we're saying a brighter apartment interests you, right? You're interested in a brighter apartment. Okay, so here basically we need a subject, right? We're not saying something simple like the apartment is brighter. we're saying a brighter apartment, right? We need that to serve as the subject. Now, in order for that to happen, right, of course, we need a nominative case noun, right? We need kvartira to serve as our subject of the verb интересует. And for that reason, we need the adjective to agree with the noun, right? So we've got to use более светлая квартира. We've got to use the compound comparative because we need светлая. We need a nominative form adjective. Now, similarly, if we take that the same example and put it into other cases, right? I'm looking for a brighter apartment. Well, I'm looking for an apartment. That's got to be in the accusative, right? We've got to have a case ending there for the adjective that will agree with its noun, right? So, я ищу более светлую квартиру. And finally, just an example of a genitive, right? Is there no brighter apartment in this city, right? So that's a non-existence expression, yet plus the genitive. Okay, so again, we need to show clearly genitive in this example, right? The noun's got to be genitive, and the adjective that goes with it has got to be genitive. And so we need a compound comparative. В этом городе нет Sorry, it's a kind of an exclamation. В этом городе нет более светлой квартиры. Okay, and another thing, obviously, is if we use a comparative after a preposition, right, to modify the object of a preposition, then, of course, well, a preposition requires a given case, right? So, for example, в, to tell location, it requires prepositional case, so we'll need a noun, for example, в квартире. And again, in a brighter apartment, the brighter part has got to modify the noun. It's got to show prepositional case endings. And so we need the compound form. Я хочу жить в более светлой квартире. Okay, so let's fill in a few examples. And all of these will require a compound comparative. So as we're doing these, we're thinking about why do we need the compound comparative? Well, again, maybe the simplest way to think about this is the adjective is coming in front of the noun, right? So again, it's not a predicate adjective situation where we're saying this apartment is brighter, but we're saying a brighter apartment interests me. I want a brighter apartment, right? The brighter is coming first, and it's agreeing with the noun. Okay, so today he's wearing a less expensive shirt. Okay, so that'll be an accusative form we need, right? Rubashku. Well, what kind of rubashku in the accusative? Well, a less expensive one. Okay, here, of course, we have no choice whatsoever. We've got to say, сегодня он носит менее дорогую рубашку. Okay, but the next one, we, in theory, have an option, right? A warmer city, right? So the basic comparative would be теплее, but here we're saying we want to live in a warmer city, right? So в preposition, we need the prepositional case to agree with городе, and so we say мы хотим жить в более теплом городе. You may think for a moment why grammatically saying мы хотим жить в теплее городе just doesn't work, right? Because well, again, hopefully it's clear at this point. We need a prepositional ending on that adjective, so we can't use an adverb instead. Number 3, I'm talking about a more interesting movie. Again, here a preposition, we need the prepositional case again. Я говорю о более интересном фильме. 4, I'm studying a harder language. Okay, this is accusative actually. Я изучаю более трудный язык. Number 5, she's interested in a more complex question. Okay, here we're getting the instrumental in the Russian. Literally, she is interested by a more complex question. Instrumental case. Она интересуется более сложным вопросом. Instrumental. I like older films. Okay, here the film, the noun with the comparative is serving as a subject, right? So we have a nominative plural. Мне нравятся более старые фильмы. Более старые. 7, I don't have enough money for a more expensive car. Okay, again, a prepositional phrase, на, we need the accusative, на машину. Well, what kind of машину? More expensive. У меня нет денег на более дорогую машину. And 8, my brothers bought cheaper cars. Мои братья купили более дешевые машины. Again, we need an accusative case, более дешевые машины, or we could say, of course, less expensive, менее дорогие машины. Okay, now let's look at a rather limited topic here. There are a few adjectives in modern Russian that do have truly adjectival comparative forms. So look at хороший, for example. Well, we learned yesterday that the basic kind of default comparative is лучше. And we've talked about how that's actually an adverb, right? It doesn't have endings that change to agree with the noun or whatever, right? But there is, again, for this particular adjective, there is an adjectival form, лучший. And so here there are 6 of these that are quite common, right? Плохой gives худший, большой больший, молодой младший, старый gives старший, and маленький gives меньший. Okay, so some of these are extremely common, like mladshi and starshi, right? Because those are used so often to talk about siblings and things like this. The main point is that when we do choose to use these, well, first of all, we can use them in front of a noun, right? So that is not in a predicate position, right? For example, я хочу меньшую порцию. And note that when we do use these, we don't need the более. This is just a simple comparative form. It's not a compound comparative. So we could say, well, for I want a smaller portion, again, it just so happens that small does have this adjectival form. So we can say, я хочу меньшую порцию, or we could always use a compound, right, and say, я хочу более маленькую порцию. Okay, but if we used one of these, for example, again, smaller in the predicate position, we wouldn't use меньшую, right? So we wouldn't say, for example, можно мне порцию меньшую, right? You could, but it sounds a bit weird. Now, the thing that Russians will say most often is they'll use just the basic adverbial comparative form, like меньше, with the по in front of it. And the по, if we were to interpret that sort of literally, it would mean a bit whatever, right? So поменьше would mean a bit smaller. But again, this type of thing is almost used by default, right? So I guess the basic point to make is that these forms with по are extremely common. We could interpret them literally to mean a bit bigger, a bit smaller, or whatever. Or just in everyday speech, we could almost think of them as sort of the default comparative forms, right? You hear them all the time. So let's practice this a bit, right? So here we're sort of back to the stuff from yesterday, right? Let's just take basic adjectives, give the adverbial comparative, right? Just the basic default comparative, which looks like an adverb, and add по in front of it, which is, again, something Russians will do all the time, right? So, for example, from тихий we get тише, and then we can add a по to it, which ultimately is optional, but it, again, is extremely common, потише. For example, можно говорить потише, пожалуйста? Or simply можно потише, right? Can you a bit more quietly? Can you more quietly? Number 2, много, that gives us больше or побольше, right? Can I have a bit more? Can I have more? Можно побольше? Можно побольше, пожалуйста? Number 3, from мало we get меньше, right? Meaning less. Поменьше would mean a bit less, right? Можно поменьше, пожалуйста? 4, from дешевый we get дешевле. Подешевле would mean a bit less expensive, right? So I can have a cheaper ticket. Можно мне билет подешевле, пожалуйста? Можно билет подешевле? Okay, 5, ранний. Comparative would be раньше. And from that we get пораньше, meaning a bit earlier. Можно пораньше, or if we include a verb, можно поехать пораньше, or можно выехать пораньше, right? Can we head off earlier, or a bit earlier? 6, поздний, late, gives позже. And so can I have a train that's a bit later? Можно поезд попозже, пожалуйста? And you see how you can get quite a bit across here with a very simple grammatical construction, right? Можно поезд попозже, right? You don't need some kind of fancy thing like, can you please find a train that departs a bit later or something like this, right? It can be very simple. Okay, простой would give проще, and then попроще, right? So can you speak more simply? Можно говорить попроще, пожалуйста? Or говорите попроще, пожалуйста? 8, частый, often gives чаще, or почаще, right? A bit more often. Можно встречаться почаще, or можно почаще встречаться. That's a fairly common little phrase there. 9, близкий gives ближе or поближе. Okay, can I have a ticket a bit closer to the stage? Again, you don't need really some fancy thing like, oh, how do I say closer to this stage? You can just say поближе, and within the context, people will get the point. Можно сидеть поближе. Можно билет поближе. Дайте билет поближе. Right? Okay, so that's some pretty useful stuff there. And in fact, you might want to go back to yesterday's lesson now that we've seen this and just add "по" next to your table of comparative forms, right? Because these comparatives in "по" are just so common in actual speech. Okay, a couple more details with comparatives, right? First of all, a construction чем тем means, like in English, the more the merrier, right? So basically we're using two comparatives. In Russian, we get things like чем больше, тем лучше, the more the merrier, right? And what we're really using here are the instrumental case forms of что and то. Чем дальше, тем хуже, the further, the worse, meaning the further along we get, the worse things get, right? Things keep getting worse and worse. Чем больше занимаешься, тем лучше будешь говорить. The more you study, the better you'll speak. One more little construction, very useful with все plus a comparative means ever, whatever, ever better, ever larger, ever more. Or another way to say that in English is, more and more, better and better, bigger and bigger, where things keep getting whatever, right? Он говорит все лучше, meaning he's speaking better and better. His speech keeps improving. You could repeat this also in Russian. Он говорит все лучше и лучше, right? So you can repeat it if you want for effect. Okay, so let's make a few of these. The earlier, the better. Чем раньше, тем лучше. Right, so remember just чем тем, and you need two comparatives. The more, the better. Чем больше, тем лучше. We're speaking Russian better and better. Okay, that's going to be a все construction. Мы говорим по-русски все лучше и лучше. Or simply все лучше. 4. Vodka keeps getting more and more expensive. Водка становится все дороже. Все дороже и дороже. A couple of posters. С каждым днем все радостнее жить. All right, with every day, it's more joyous to live. And that's a quote from Stalin, a rather notorious quote there, right, that жить стало веселее. So this, I think this isn't a direct quote of Stalin. He said жить стало веселее, but it's kind of the same idea, right? Life keeps getting better in the Soviet Union with every day. Here's another poster of все выше и выше, right? Ever higher, higher and higher. And another one, чем больше нефти, тем сильнее наша Родина. The more oil, the stronger our homeland. Okay, now finally let's talk about superlatives. And the good news is that these are quite easy, really. They're extremely easy in Russian. In fact, we don't need any special forms at all, really. We just need to throw in an additional adjective, самый, which is itself an adjective. It's going to modify, whatever noun. It's going to agree with whatever noun we're talking about. And so we just take this form самый and combine it with the actual adjective itself, and we get superlatives, right? So from дорогой, we get самый дорогой, the most expensive. Here, of course, we see the masculine forms, but these could be feminine forms or plural, or in any case whatsoever. Самый дешевый is the cheapest. Самый интересный, the most interesting. Самый большой, the biggest. And then two important exceptions, and these are really the only ones that you would ever see with any frequency. The best is самый лучший, and the worst is самый худший. Now, do keep in mind that sometimes Russians will simply use лучший or худший as meaning the best or the worst, right? Not really better or worse, but as the best or the worst. So in that sense, the самый here is somewhat optional. But, anyway, it's... Okay, so let's look at some examples. Я купил самую дешевую книгу. Okay, we're modifying book. We want to say the cheapest book. Book is in the accusative, so we get full agreement. Самую дешевую книгу. These books are the cheapest, the most inexpensive. Эти книги самые дешевые. They're in the plural. По-моему, это самый интересный русский film. This is the most interesting Russian film. They're in the masculine. Это самый лучший фильм, который я смотрел. This is the most interesting film which I have watched, right, that I've seen. Okay, we can say one of the exist, right, one of the best, one of the biggest, one of the worst, etc. kind of like in English, right? Один is plus the genitive plural, right? This is one of the most interesting films. Okay, so again, we get here genitive plural with both of these adjectives. Это один из самых интересных русских фильмов, right? And we're getting, of course, genitive plural across the board. This is one of the most interesting Russian films, genitive plural. Это одна из самых лучших книг, которую я читал. This is one of the best books I've read. Right, one of the best books, right? That's all genitive plural in Russian. Okay, let's make a few of these, and let's just start out with simple superlatives, right? This is the largest whatever in the city. The Hermitage is the largest museum in the city. Эрмитаж – самый большой музей в городе. War and Peace is the longest novel in the library. Война и мир – самый длинный роман в библиотеке. This place or this seat is the best in the theater. Это место самое лучшее в театре. Now there we don't really need to repeat место because we already know what we're speaking about. Это место самое лучшее в театре. 4. This palace is the most beautiful palace in Russia. Это дворец самый красивый дворец в России. Okay, so again, these are extremely simple constructions, thankfully. Let's do here just some more examples with some different cases. I live in the smallest room in the dorm. Okay, here we need prepositional, of course. Я живу в самой маленькой комнате в общежитии, right? So в комнате, we need prepositional singular for this feminine noun. В самой маленькой комнате. 2. I bought the sweetest puppy in the world. Я купил, or я купила, самого милого щенка на свете. Right here we have a masculine animate accusative. Самого милого щенка, so of course it looks like genitive. 3. We were drinking the cheapest vodka in the restaurant. Мы пили самую дешевую водку в ресторане. There, a feminine accusative singular. Okay, let's try some of these. Один is, right? One of the biggest, largest, smallest, etc. So here we're gonna get genitive plural. I live in one of the smallest rooms in the dorm. Я живу, okay, we got to be careful here. We're going to conjugate один. We need it in the feminine prepositional singular. So it's going to be Я живу в одной из самых маленьких комнат в общежитии. Right, so that's a little bit trickier, but the grammar is fairly straightforward ultimately. I live in one of the smallest rooms, right? And all that's going into the genitive plural. Russian is one of the hardest languages. Русский язык – один из самых трудных языков. We could say в мире or something, right, in the world. Русский язык – один из самых трудных языков. Right, and now let's think a minute. We're saying it's one language of the most difficult languages, right? So we're getting один because we're thinking about the noun язык. Один из самых трудных языков. 3, this is the best kvass I've ever drunk. Okay, kvass is going to be masculine. Это самый лучший квас, который я пил. Okay, so that does it for this chapter. So we've covered a lot of ground here, some fairly difficult stuff, starting with the genitive plural, and then these comparisons are also maybe a little bit tricky. The next chapter, we're going to, again, tie up some loose ends and also complete our knowledge of the Russian case system, right? We're going to learn our remaining plural cases. And so once we cover that stuff, we'll be well on our way to really learning Russian, and we'll be able at that point to begin really trying to speak it, right? Because we'll have all the case forms. Okay, anyway, so until next time, до свидания, товарищи, вперед к новым победам.